This is going to be a breakdown of my redesign for Jedi Survivor, where I had a go at just making the Force abilities for Cal and Darth Vader, using Skanner to make some of my source sounds. So the aesthetic for Cal that I used ended up being very natural and warm. I wanted it almost to sound like wind or cloth, so his abilities feel more like a force of nature since he's the protagonist. To do this, I started by recording some cloth foley, mainly me hitting things like shirts and jackets, as well as just moving them around in front of the mic for some interesting textures. I also got this tape ripping sound just because it had a nice aggressive quality without sounding too distorted or synthetic, kind of like a roar almost. I'm then putting them through Skanner XT. Thanks to Noah Citrin for introducing me to this. I'll link his original video in the description. Basically, it's just scanning across the audio file with extra bits of processing and reverb along with some oscillators that modulate the sound. But this preset morpher is the thing I'm really interested in, which adds loads of movement when you're shifting between the different settings and shifting across different parts of the waveform. I'm then running them through an effects rack afterwards, which is a disperser made out of Ableton's EQ3. You can get this just by stacking them and then moving around the frequency crossovers. I've gone through this in another video already, I'll link that. Then Serum effects, where I'm adding hyperdimension, all-pass filtering and compression, just to make it a bit more sci-fi and glue it together a bit, along with some EQ just to change the frequency focus because it can get quite bass heavy. These are the core elements of this rack, but I'm constantly adjusting it and using extra stuff like distortion, pitch shifting, Valhalla space modulator, M ratio MB and subsynth to create really crunchy sounds by overloading the low end. As with all source creation, it's just about experimentation, throwing things at the wall, and using any effect you think might have an interesting output. So there's no part of this rack that stays constant the whole time. Here are some of the results. So in Reaper now, where I'm arranging all of this, all of Cal's abilities have three parts to them. These tonal elements, the crunchy scanner elements, and these physical explosion tails to worldize the sounds of it. The tonal elements are little bits from Skanner or other design sounds that I've made, with hyperdimension, little plate, Valhalla space modulator after the reverb, and some pitch shifting, alongside some EQ to cut the lows and tame the frequencies as I need. The idea behind these is to have a sound that notifies the player that the force is being used, either by them or an enemy, so I'm using this same kind of sounds in Darth Vader's abilities as well. The pitch shifting and space modulator after the reverb just gives it this really interesting, abstract Star Wars quality to my ears. It feels very distinctive and means that I can put just about anything tonal in there and it'll all sound kind of similar, which helps because a lot of the source from Skanner is very overly noisy. There's not a lot of tonality there. For the main kind of body elements from Skanner, it's mainly just a matter of layering and EQing to give them all their own space in time and frequency spectrum. On the stack, I tend to use stuff like subsynth to give them weight and a nice crunchy distortion. Even if I end up taking the lows out of them afterwards for something else, it still kind of has a nice crunch to it. Driver really helps that as well. Driver after subsynth gives it a super nice crunchy distortion that sometimes isn't even that extreme, but just gives it the feeling of having a lot of power. Transient Master also helps give the sound a clear kind of impact point because the animations aren't super long, so it helps to make it very obvious as to where the focus should be and where the power is coming from. The physical elements are mainly tails from Mattia Cellotto's Cataclysm library, either trailing off from the impacts or building up to them to create these kind of bright whooshes that can get really nice and crunchy when it's being distorted alongside the main elements, or when I put things like phasing on them to make the tails more interesting and sci-fi. Not a whole lot of processing here other than some EQ and distortion. I also have these little bits of rock and pebble movement for the slam and push to worldize it more. I'm also using some of the transients from these explosions for the slam ability with M ratio to soften them up a bit so they don't sound as intense. On the overall whole stack, I tend to use similar processing across all three of these sounds to make them feel unified. More driver, just to add some danger and glue the elements together. It doesn't add a whole lot of high end, which I like. Another transient master, just to make the high impact point really stand out. And G mono bass to make the low end mono and a bit clearer. I tried using M ratio MB on the whole stack to glue it a bit more, but most of the time it ended up taking away too much detail and you didn't really feel the full power of the sound. so I'm only using it on the pull here, with the amount tied to the amplitude so I can keep more detail in the tails and build up. The slam also has some fire distorting it more because it seemed like the most powerful ability, and I wanted to really make that come through in the tone of the sound. I'm also using some width and gain automation to really get the dynamic shape that I like and build some more movement across the sound. Something I want to show here that didn't make it into the final redesign was the lightsaber for this first clip. I tried to make a sound for it using some of the electromagnetic coil source that I'm going to talk about in a bit, but it didn't really fit, and I only intended to make sound for the Force abilities anyway, so here that is. So Darth Vader obviously has a very different feel to Cal, and I wanted to reflect the more robotic and sinister feeling that he has. To achieve this, I used a lot of synthetic source as well as electromagnetic coil recordings, and made the frequency content of his abilities very scooped, so they have really overpowering low end and super bright high end, with less focus on the mids because that's where a lot of Cal's stuff ended up. So back in Skanner, I'm running these coil recordings through a similar rack, but this time using a bit more M ratio MB and distortion. If you go out and try to record this stuff yourself, I recommend Ether by Soma. I don't have one for this video to film, but I have used it and it's great. Computers and phones are really the best things to record because they have different components inside that you can morph between live, like the battery and the CPU and those different kind of things. It's also really interesting to record them as you turn them on and off because the circuits in them sound very interesting when they're doing that. Things like consoles and TVs are also good, just things with different electrical components inside them that you can move around, create really nice whooshes. I ended up using mostly more kind of clean tonal recordings from things like guitar amps and certain parts of computers, alongside a few more crackly rhythmic recordings that I thought would work well. So here's what they sound like. I also used this technique where I took loads of explosions and massively distorted and compressed them in a previous session, then took them, crossfaded a few of them together into one long file. You get this really interesting movement between the different tones of the explosions without there being much volume movement, and it makes really great source sounds that sound really dangerous and angry, especially when you're kind of distorting and compressing them more. Here's what that sounds like. So back in Reaper, I'm using a lot of similar concepts here, but with different material and processing. These tonal elements are here again, using the exact same effect rack, but now I'm using mostly these coil recordings, which have been put through Skanner, with some automation of the pitch as well to match some of the movement in the animations. I think using these lower, more synthetic tones makes it sound more dangerous and angry, while still reading as the Force still. Since these have lower fundamentals, I'm having to carve out some space with a dynamic EQ for every other element of the sound, ducking that fundamental frequency in the other elements. The main body element here actually has three main components. These are the foam roller recordings from Cataclysm, which have a really nice clean low end that feels very organic but still quite powerful. I'm using very subtle hyperdimension on these to give them a little bit more movement, as well as transient master, because they're serving as kind of the main impact, so they have to have some punch. The other source in this body stack is the explosions that I put through Skanner earlier, subtly adding a few more high mids and aggressiveness. I didn't use these as much as I thought, but they do serve as a nice background layer when they have the lows removed, and IVG12 is great for making them even more kind of crunchy and over the top as well. Finally, these really nice clicks that I got from taking one of the synthesized elements from Cataclysm and pitching it down about 2 octaves with some M ratio, driver and air to make them super bright and clicky, as well as taking out all the lows and most of the mids. I love how they add to the main impact and they add to the kind of scooped feeling I want for Vader's sounds, making them synthetic without seeming like they're just coming out of serum. They sound a little bit more kind of interesting. Lastly, for the physical tails, I'm using the same idea as Cal to add whooshes. Again, they get super nice and crunchy when distorted alongside the other elements, which I love. Additionally, for the lightsabers in the final clip, I wasn't really trying to make the sound for them, more the force powers being used alongside them. The crunchy transients here are actually being made from super distorted saxophone recordings with IVG-12 and a reverb after them to give them this super angry sound, which is also the kind of main sound that plays when Vader lifts his hand. Having the distortion after the reverb, I think, just makes it sound so angry, which I love. I also have these nice bone cracking sounds, which have had the high frequencies taken out as well as the stereo mids taken out, so they kind of feel like they're happening to the player or kind of inside the player's head. They also have a bit of M ratio to soften them, and they're being pitched down to sound more like body parts rather than, you know, eggs and vegetables and stuff, which they are. It's kind of a classic Darth Vader sound from the films, which I wanted to add here. On the whole stack for Darth Vader's abilities, I'm using Panks for some clipping and multi-band transient shaping. I'm taking the tails way down on the low end because they're getting a bit too much, especially with all the reverb I'm using, and boosting the tail of the tonal elements fundamental, so kind of the low mids, so it stands out more in the tail. A little bit of this presence and New York compression makes the sound a bit more fat and readable overall, and Transient Master is doing kind of the same thing, just making sure the impact points are really obvious and that the tails feel like tails. Little plate is actually mixed in here as well on the whole stack super subtly. I kind of use this to communicate that the sound was happening to the player. It makes it a little bit more washy, and distorting it after the reverb adds a lot of aggression, which I mentioned earlier. The exciter in Neutron is what I'm using for my distortion here. It's nice and crunchy and doesn't add a whole lot of high end on the retro setting, which I like. It serves more as glue than making it sound really over the top, because a lot of the elements were already distorted. And on the push and pull, I'm kind of going back on that by distorting the highs independently with trash, just because they weren't standing out quite enough and I didn't really want to boost them with an EQ. I thought this sounded a bit more natural and just added even more aggression and power. Finally, in this section of the final clip where Cere does this push and lightsaber throw, it's using the same palette as Cal's stuff. It's the kind of cloth and tape through scanner with similar processing as well. The lightsaber here uses more electromagnetic coil source with some more clicky design stuff that I made ages ago using vocoders layered in. Frequency and pitch shifting here makes them feel a bit bigger and move the fundamentals down to where I want them, while still making the sound feel very bright in the highs. And I'm using the same tonal palette here, going through the same effect as well, just a little more distorted and a bit less evil sounding to make it a bit more powerful without coming across as sinister. That's going to be it for this breakdown. I hope you learned something, and thanks for watching.